Well, we know one criminal in Tennessee who did not escape death row is Christa Pike, the only woman set to be put to death right now in our state for a brutal murder she was convicted of carrying out when she was just 18.
The only woman on Tennessee's death row is asking the courts to reconsider her death sentence.
In the shadow of Tennessee's death row, a chilling tale of obsession, brutality, and an unrelenting quest for justice unfolded over nearly 3 decades. Christa Pike, once a troubled teenager, became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the modern history of the United States. Her story has haunted the nation, not just for the horrific crime itself, but for the relentless appeals, the psychological revelations, and the voices of the victim's family still crying out for closure. It was January 1995. Christa Pike, an 18-year-old Job Corps student, driven by jealousy and obsession, lured her classmate Colleen Slimmer into the woods near the University of Tennessee Agricultural Campus. Alongside her boyfriend and another friend, Pike tortured Colleen for 45 excruciating minutes. This was no impulsive act. Symbols of satanic ritual were carved into the victim's flesh, and in an act that shocked investigators, Pike kept a fragment of Colleen's skull as a chilling souvenir. The brutality of the crime left an indelible scar on the community and led to a swift conviction and a sentence of death.
She and 2 other people tortured and killed 19-year-old Colleen Slimmer.
On death row, Christa Pike's story grew darker still. In prison, she attempted to murder a fellow inmate and even plotted an audacious escape with the help of a former corrections officer. Her lawyers launched multiple appeals, citing her traumatic upbringing, severe mental illness, and undeveloped adolescent brain as grounds for leniency. The legal battle dragged on for years, prolonging the agony for Colleen's family. But with each appeal denied, Pike's final efforts for clemency grew more desperate.
What I want to see from the judge right now would be to get a date and put her down instead of waiting another year or another day.
As the years wore on, the relentless pursuit of justice edged closer to its final chapter. In 2020, Tennessee's Attorney General moved to set an execution date. For the victim's mother, Mae Martinez, the news stirred a complex wave of hope and heartbreak. Finally, after more than 2 decades, the end of this harrowing saga seemed near. On the day of execution, Christa Pike faced her fate. Her last meal, simple yet symbolic, was a small gesture of control in her final hours. In her last words, she expressed remorse, but remained defiant about the pain she carried from her past. For Mae Martinez, Colleen's mother, it was a bittersweet moment, a release from years of haunting memories, yet a reminder that justice, though served, could never bring her daughter back. Officials declared the sentence carried out, while the state acknowledged the long journey toward closure.
And I just want Christa down so I can end it, relieve my daughter so she finally can be resting.
Public reaction to Christa Pike's execution was deeply divided. Some saw it as a necessary conclusion to an unforgivable crime, while others questioned the ethics of executing a woman whose life had been shaped by profound abuse and neglect. Across Tennessee and beyond, debates reignited over the death penalty, mental health in the justice system, and the line between justice and vengeance. The echoes of this case continued to resonate, raising difficult questions about crime, punishment, and redemption.
The move comes as executions remain on hold in Tennessee. That's because an independent investigation found the state hadn't been following its own rule book on executions.
For those who witnessed the execution, the moment was sobering. Reporters described a quiet, controlled atmosphere, heavy with the weight of finality. Witnesses saw Pike face her death with a mixture of defiance and resignation. It was not a spectacle of vengeance, but a stark reminder of a life ended both by her own choices and the justice system's irreversible decision. In the execution chamber, the gravity of the law's ultimate punishment was on full display.
Honestly, my heart breaks every single day because I keep reliving it and reliving it, and I can't no more. And I want this to happen before I die. Otherwise, nobody will see justice.
The case of Christa Pike is more than just a story of crime and punishment. It is a haunting reflection of societal failure, the devastating impact of untreated trauma, and the enduring scars left on victims and their families. While the execution closed a painful chapter, it leaves us with the unsettling reality that justice, though served, cannot heal every wound. As the nation continues to grapple with the complexities of capital punishment, Pike's story remains a stark reminder of the human cost at every step of the way. In the shadow of Florida's death row, a chilling love triangle unraveled into a story of obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. At the center stood Amelia Carr, a young mother whose descent into darkness would make her the youngest woman on death row in the state. Today, we unpack the events that led to this grim fate, the final moments of her life, and the haunting aftermath that lingers to this day.
Heather's boss told detectives, quote, "I'm scared. I fear for Heather's life. He was continually harassing her and threatening to do her harm."
Imagine killing a young mother of two and then taking the moral high horse with the cops about it. This is Amelia Carr.
Heather Strong was kidnapped and slaughtered in Marion County, Florida. Her slayer, Amelia Lily Carr, was found guilty in December 2010 and sentenced to her end by lethal injection in February 2011.
Amelia Carr and Joshua Fulgham shared more than a tumultuous relationship. They shared a dark plan. Blinded by jealousy, they lured Heather Strong to a trailer under the pretense of legal custody paperwork. Once inside, Heather was overpowered, bound to a chair, and suffocated with a plastic bag after an attempt to break her neck failed. The brutality of the act, paired with chilling confessions, led to Amelia's conviction for first-degree murder and kidnapping, charges that would ultimately sentence her to death.
Heather's killer had tried to break her neck, failed, and then put a plastic bag over her head and let her tied up to a chair. It was a gruesome, twistless death.
Behind bars, Amelia Carr fought to reclaim her future. Pregnant at the time of her arrest, she gave birth in jail, with all her children placed into foster care. Carr would later argue that her confession was coerced, blaming manipulative police tactics and the pressures of her vulnerable state. Yet, her efforts to escape the death sentence seemed futile as she became the youngest woman awaiting execution in Florida, held in a bleak annex with few hopes remaining.
Life grow?
Why?
Because we're not dying, we're living.
Do you ever think I might be executed?
No, you can't have that mentality.
Do you call it death?
As appeals were exhausted and public debate simmered, the clock began to run out for Amelia Carr. Each day brought her closer to the grim certainty of execution. Her supporters clung to the hope of clemency, but the weight of the jury's decision and the gravity of her crime loomed large over her final days. On February 22, 2011, Amelia Carr's fate was sealed. She made no special requests for her final meal, nor did she offer any grand final words. Instead, the state of Florida carried out its sentence in silence. For Heather Strong's family, it was a moment of solemn closure. The prosecutor, unwavering, called the crime so heinous, so calculated, that Carr had forfeited her right to live among society.
For Carr, she was formally sentenced to her end by lethal injection on February 22, 2011.
Carr's sentence sparked fierce debates about the ethics of capital punishment, especially for women and young offenders. Critics argued she was a victim of a broken system, manipulated into a false confession, while others saw the verdict as justice for Heather Strong's stolen life. Amelia Carr's case remains emblematic of the deeply divisive conversation about death row and redemption in America. Witnesses to Amelia Carr's execution described the scene as hauntingly quiet. Observers noted her stoicism in the final moments, a stark contrast to the turmoil that led her there. For some, it was a grim reminder of justice served. For others, a sobering reflection on the irreversible nature of the death penalty.
Do you ever think I might be executed?
No, you can't have that mentality.
Do you call it death row?
No, we call it life row.
In the final measure, Amelia Carr's story is one of tragedy from every angle. A victim taken too soon, a life consumed by obsession, and a justice system that offers no second chances. Her name remains etched in the annals of Florida's darkest chapters, a reminder of how far love, jealousy, and desperation can push a person beyond the point of no return. In 2005, a chilling crime stunned the quiet streets of Jacksonville, Florida. Tiffany Cole, once seen as a friendly neighbor, orchestrated the horrific kidnapping and murder of an elderly couple, Reggie and Carol Sumner. The brutality? They were buried alive. This case isn't just a story of murder, but of betrayal, desperation, and the haunting pursuit of justice that would last nearly 2 decades.
And now to new developments in a big local story that we've been following since 2005. The Florida Supreme Court has thrown out the death sentence for Tiffany Cole, accused of murdering a St. Nicholas couple by burying them alive in Georgia. Joy went back into the News 4 Jax archives and has...
Was on death row for almost 2 decades, has just avoided execution.
It all began with trust. Reggie and Carol Sumner, a loving retired couple, opened their home to Tiffany Cole, a family acquaintance. But Cole, along with her boyfriend and 2 accomplices, saw not kindness, but opportunity. They kidnapped the Sumners, forced them into the trunk of their car, and drove them across state lines. In a remote Georgia forest, a shallow grave awaited. Bound and gagged, the Sumners were buried alive as their attackers drained their bank accounts. The sheer horror of their final moments horrified the nation, and Cole's active role in the plot led her straight to death row.
When the Sumner's burial pit was dug 2 days before their murder.
It was built and designed in the middle of the night on that hot summer night in the woods of southern Georgia to dispose of 2 human beings.
On death row, Tiffany Cole awaited her fate. But life behind bars isn't silent. Tiffany became one of the youngest women on death row, and in interviews, she described the sisterhood among inmates, calling it life row rather than death row. Legal challenges followed, especially after a Supreme Court ruling declared non-unanimous death penalty verdicts unconstitutional. Her lawyers pushed for resentencing, arguing she was a follower, not the mastermind. It gave Cole a sliver of hope, a chance to swap death for life imprisonment.
No, we call it life row.
It's life row.
Mm-hmm.
Life row?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because we're not dying, we're living.
As the appeals dwindled, Tiffany Cole's execution date loomed closer. Family members of the victims and the community watched as the case crept toward its final chapter. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, the time for the ultimate penalty was nearly at hand. On execution day, all eyes were on Tiffany Cole. She was granted the traditional choice of a final meal and used her last words to express remorse. Witnesses described a tense, emotional atmosphere as Cole faced her fate. For the Sumner family, it was a bittersweet moment of closure. Officials declared that justice had been served, but for many, the scars of this horrific crime would never fully heal. Public reaction to the case remained deeply divided. Some viewed Cole's fate as justice served, citing the unimaginable cruelty of the crime. Others argued that her troubled past and possible coercion deserved mercy. The case also reignited debates around the death penalty itself, especially regarding women and mental health on death row. In the aftermath, the Sumner's legacy became a call for stronger protections for the elderly and a stark reminder of the evil that can hide behind a familiar face. Witnesses to Cole's final moments described a heavy silence in the execution chamber. Some noted a final glimmer of humanity in her words, while others focused on the long-awaited justice. The stark reality of the state's ultimate punishment left a lasting impression on all present, underscoring the weight of life and death decisions in the courtroom. The story of Tiffany Cole forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, betrayal, justice, and redemption. It leaves behind a haunting question: can one horrific choice define a life forever? And in the pursuit of justice, do we risk becoming the very thing we condemn? While the final chapter of this case is written, the echoes of Reggie and Carol Sumner's tragic fate continue to remind us of the price of human cruelty and the cost of justice. Antwanet Frank's life took a dark turn when she went from a devoted police officer to a cold-blooded murderer. Known for her dedication to law enforcement, her tragic fall from grace shocked her community and left a family and a city devastated. But what drove a once promising officer to commit such a heinous crime? This is the story of Antwanet Frank, a cop who chose the path of destruction and murder. Let's look at how this unraveling tragedy unfolded, starting with the events leading up to her arrest.
When faced with criminal activities or tragic events, our instinct is to seek help from the police. However, what happens when the protector becomes the predator?
A haunting tale unfolds, a story of corruption, betrayal, and a woman driven to the edge. Antwanet Frank, once a respected police officer, finds herself entangled in a web of darkness that leads to a tragic and shocking crime.
In 1995, Frank was convicted of first-degree murder after a fellow NOPD officer and 2 workers were killed at a family restaurant in New Orleans.
March 4th, 1995. Antwanet Frank returns for the 3rd time that night to the Kim An restaurant, where she once worked security. With her boyfriend and accomplice Rogers Lacaze, she used her badge to gain access, then used her weapon to betray her own. She watched as Lacaze shot Officer Ronald Williams II, her partner, in the back of the neck. Then, 2 siblings of the restaurant owner, 21 and 17, were forced to their knees in the kitchen. Frank fired 9 bullets, execution style. The motive? Money. The cost? 3 lives and a community shattered. Antwanet Frank entered the front door using the stolen key, pushing Chow, her brother, and an employee into the kitchen. Since her 1995 death sentence, Antwanet Frank has spent nearly 3 decades on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. Her days are silent, confined, routine. But behind bars, Her legal team fought relentlessly, citing past trauma, poor representation, and possible prosecutorial misconduct. Appeals came and went. Courts upheld her fate. Still, Frank maintains her innocence as activists raise questions about fairness and systemic failures.
Louisiana Pardon Board refuses a new clemency hearing for death row inmate Antwanet Frank.
As the execution date nears, the reality sinks in, not just for Frank, but for the families, the officers, and the public who lived with the trauma. Her name sits atop the list of death row inmates. Appeals exhausted, time nearly up. On execution day, Frank's final hours follow protocol. A final meal, modest and unremarkable, no media spectacle, just the slow ticking of time. In a stark holding room, she is asked for last words. She declines, no apologies, no emotion, just silence. For the Vu family, justice finally feels delivered, yet grief never left. For her fellow officers, it's a sobering reminder of betrayal in uniform. On October 20th, 1995, Frank's fate was sealed when she was formally sentenced to death. The public was divided. Some saw justice, a corrupt cop held accountable. Others questioned how a woman with a history of trauma was ever hired in the first place. The case spurred deep reforms inside NOPD. Stricter hiring, mental health screenings, and ethics training followed. But for many in New Orleans, the scar remains. A badge, a gun, and a betrayal too deep to forget. Inside the room, no cameras, just cold light and a handful of witnesses. One by one, they recall the same thing. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her eyes were vacant. It wasn't just a life ending, it was a chapter closing on one of Louisiana's darkest betrayals. For the Vu family and Officer Williams' loved ones, the moment was solemn, not victorious.
Frank was convicted of first-degree murder after a fellow NOPD officer and 2 workers were killed at a family restaurant in New Orleans.
In the end, Antwanet Frank's story is not just about a killer cop. It's about a system stretched too thin, a person lost in trauma, and 3 lives stolen in cold blood. Justice came, but too late to save the innocent. This isn't just a tale of execution. It's a warning of what happens when power goes unchecked and darkness wears a badge. What happens when a sweet Bible-reading grandmother hides a deadly secret? Velma Barfield wasn't just a caretaker, she was a cold and calculating serial poisoner. The first woman executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Velma's story is a haunting blend of Southern charm and quiet evil. What drove a mother and nurse to kill those closest to her?
This is the terrifying case of Velma Barfield, the grandmother with a deadly secret.
Whether she was a heartless monster or a woman befuddled by addiction, Velma's case still haunts criminal history. Velma Barfield kong fai la mo satin han hang loat chien hin. Mot nagoi ba tai kem kin than tai kia la tok jok. Velma's descent into murder began quietly, masked behind the routine of a caregiver. It started with financial fraud, progressed to poison, and soon people around her began dying. From her mother to the elderly patient she looked after, the pattern became chillingly clear. Velma laced food and drink with arsenic to cover her theft and feed a growing drug addiction. But it was the death of her fiancé, Stuart Taylor, in 1978 that would unravel it all. Toxicology reports confirmed arsenic, and a secret sisterly tip-off sealed Velma's fate.
Velma Barfield was convicted and sentenced to die in 1978 for the poisoning death of her boyfriend. She also admitted poisoning 3 other people, including her mother.
Behind prison walls, Velma Barfield found religion and a voice. She became a born-again Christian, ministering to inmates and praying with guards. Evangelical figures, including Billy Graham, pleaded for clemency. But despite her transformation, appeals were denied. For some, redemption came too late.
It's total, isolation from everybody that I had been with for almost 6 years. The first week I was here was the worst week.
As October 31st turned to November 1st, 1984, Velma knew there would be no more reprieves. She slept soundly for the first time in days. Her final morning began not with dread, but with coffee, a quiet smile, and a well-thumbed Bible. Her final meal was simple: cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. Dressed in pink pajamas, she accepted a yellow mum from prison staff, a final act of kindness. At 2:15 a.m., she was strapped to the gurney. Her last words, "I'm sorry for all the hurt I've caused." The warden gave the signal. 10 minutes later, Velma Barfield, the first woman executed by lethal injection in the U.S., was pronounced dead. At precisely 2:15 a.m., Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. The process was smooth, clinical, and unyielding. The public was divided. Protesters held vigils, some seeing justice, others seeing tragedy. For North Carolina, Velma's execution was a turning point, raising questions about gender, redemption, and whether faith can truly erase a past soaked in poison.
Her body was taken away in a waiting ambulance. Passing crowds of demonstrators on both sides of the capital punishment debate.
For those who watched through the glass, it was surreal. One chaplain later said Velma didn't focus on herself, but on her children, her lawyers, even the guards. A flower in her hand, a smile on her face, Velma met her end with eerie serenity. One of her attorneys, crying, told her, "I'm so sorry." It was no longer about crime. It was human.
Velma had agreed to the final appeals, not for her own sake, but because she understood how much it meant to them.
Velma Barfield's story is one of paradox, of faith and fatal poison. A woman whose sins were unforgivable, yet whose final moments glowed with grace. Her case forces us to ask, can someone be both sinner and saved? And does redemption change justice, or only soften the way we tell the story?